So as I noted in the announcement that I sent out, I've done another outline of the layout of the Hebrew text of the end of Genesis chapter 13 and the latter portions of Genesis 14. I just want to highlight in these few moments a few of the elements of the text that are notable. When I talk about Hebrew narrative and the aspects of literary devices, we often refer to as rhetoric. Rhetoric has to do with the devices that you use for emphasis. Just like we do in preaching, one of the ways of bringing emphasis is repetition. Especially if you listen to African American, we do it some. African American preachers do a lot of this. They repeat with like beginning words are the same and the ending words are different. And Dr. Fred Luter, when he comes and speaks in chapel at seminary, he'll do shout outs to different faculty and other people that are in the audience by saying, well, Dr. Cole, it's like this. Well, Dr. England, it's like this. And so we, this kind of doing repetition in the text. And repetition can be the same word. Sometimes it can be repetition of certain grammatical, morphological words, like repeating vayomers in, Vayomer, Vayomer Adonai El Moshe, God spoke to Moses, Yahweh spoke to Moses, and then it's followed by Moses spoke to God, and this, you repeat elements like that in a flowing dialogue of narrative. Other types of repetition we saw in our last video session, the four sequences of et, which your indicator of your direct object. So it would be et something, et blank, et blank, et blank. And so repetition is one. Another means, and there are a couple of them that are highlighted in the commentary by Dr. Waldke, are chiastic structures. Chiastic structures are, it comes from the Greek letter chi, which is the X, and it moves toward a narrative or poetic moves toward a pivotal point. And the pivotal point is the main point of a chiastic structure. So if you're moving toward the highlight, the central theme of a passage, typically a chiasm will be bracketed by an idea we call the inclusio. An inclusion. We talk about an inclusion, that which is similar in the beginning and in the end. One of the items I think that I posted up in the Blackboard area was an outline of the reign of Solomon as it's described in the book of Kings, chapters 1 to 11. The pivotal point in that narrative is Solomon's gradual but now pivotal point, where in the middle of the temple construction, there's a focus on Solomon's building his own palace, which took almost twice as long to build his palace as it took to build the temple, 13 years versus 7, and that he's building a judgment hall that imitates Egyptian architecture, and he's building a palace for his wife, who is Pharaoh's daughter. At that point, he's wanting us to really note that there's a problem going on in Solomon's reign. Now, it started back in chapter 3 with the introduction of his marriage to the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter, which every good student of Deuteronomy knows was off limits. Deuteronomy 17 says, when you come into the land, you request a king, here are the requirements for kingship. One of those is we don't go back to Egypt for anything. That's where God delivered us from. We don't go back. But it introduces in just a brief verse there in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, verse 1, Solomon enters into a marriage relationship with Pharaoh's daughter. He builds up to that point where Solomon who rightly walked with God. We're told that right after the marriage verses in chapter 3. We have the revelation there at Gibeon, the dream, the gift of wisdom, and so forth. But the text is going to move eventually toward that material in chapters 6, 7, 8 in 1 Kings. So again, chiasm. So Solomon's reign begins with trouble with his half-brother Adonijah. Solomon's reign ends with the rebellion of various groups like the Edomites and the Arameans, those people that his father David had conquered. So Solomon becomes unfaithful, and the beginning of that unfaithfulness, which is described very vividly at the beginning of chapter 11. The trouble started in the beginning. For the first part of his reign, Solomon was faithful, but the marriage to foreign women, starting with, as the text describes, the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, would continue, and Solomon then becomes unfaithful. And the curses of the covenant, which are highlighted in the material in those central chapters of 1 Kings, come to fruition. And Solomon, the greatest of the kings, becomes the beginning of the end in the latter part of his reign. And the idolatry, which had been purged from the land, the latter part of the Judges period, and into the Samuel material, now idolatry has re-entered through the king, Solomon, who would build temples to his wives' deities, from the Moabites to the Edomites to the Ammonites and so forth. Again, these types of structures. So back again to the conclusion, as we highlighted in our previous discussion. Genesis 13 ends with the reiteration of the promise of the land. After the division with Lot, the land, as God says in verse 14, sa-na. Sometimes we translate this particle of entreaty, na, sa-na, look please. Lift up your eyes. Ura'eh, and look. From the place, min makom, asher atah sam, where you are positioned. So where you are, right where you are. Again, generally somewhere probably in the vicinity of Bethel, which is right at the bridge of the hill country, the ridge line that runs north-south through the hill country. And he said, Safonah, which is north, Negev, toward the Negev, so toward the north, toward the south. Kedemah, Kedem is east. Sometimes it's called Mizrahi. And then Yama, toward the sea. So again, remember each of those has that directional hey on the end of the word. Look to the north, the south, the east, and of course the sea is on the west, the Mediterranean. Ki, now, description that Kol ha'aretz asher atah roeh. Look, and everything that you are seeing, cow participle, to you, emphasis at the beginning, I will give. Et tanana. I will indeed, with emphasis the cohortative, to lezaracha, your seed, ad olam, for perpetuity, for on and on, forever. I will give, again, so the promise is made of the land. And then samti zaraka, ka'afer ha'aretz, I will make your seed like the dust of the earth. Later on, you'll use the phraseology in Genesis 15, the sands of the seashore, the innumerable people of the descendants. And of course, the background, you can see Abraham sitting there Okay, now I don't even have one yet. Yeah. Later on, he's going to say, "Hello, I've adopted Eliezer of Damascus. He's the only one I have. Lord, you really got this promise in mind for multiple descendants, and we don't even have one yet." But the promise is made. So he is instructed again, the imperatives, Kum Hithalek, get up, rise up, and hit the Hithpael, imperative Hithalek, be walking, go about walking. One of the uses of the Hithpael stem is what we call the durative or iterative. It denotes continuing action. Be walking about, like the Australian do a walkabout, where you walk about the area of your land holdings. Do a walkabout. Rise up and walk about in the land. Where the araka to its length, and rachav is breadth or width. To you I will give it. So that same word, etanana, I will give. So the promise of the land is reiterated. From that point, Abram has encountered God at Bethel. They have split ways. God has reaffirmed the land promised to Abram and his descendants. Now Abram is going to journey back down to the south, down to the region of Hebron, the oaks of Mamre, Aloneh, Mamre, which is, by the way, that area we're pretty confident about, this particular oaks of Mamre area. Excavations were done there a number of decades ago now. That is kind of on the northwest side of modern day Hebron. So, and again, chapter concludes, Abram builds an altar. He worships God, builds an altar, offers sacrifices on that altar. Again, the altar in the ancient world, the point of mediation between God and humanity. All right.